Okay, I think, but it is 10:31, 5:31 in Israel, so it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Lasker to his third and final part of this mini-series. Please, God, we'll have him back again for another series. I'm glad I could be here in person. The first two classes I had to listen to afterwards, and it's really a pleasure. And we're going to do today I've been thinking the intellectual accomplishments, I believe, of the Karaite movement, the rabbinates and the Karaites. So, Bakasha, Dr. Lasker. We're eager to hear what you have to say.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy that Rabbi Kelman is able to join us, and that his school vacation begins soon when he finishes correcting all his exams. 2 weeks ago, I talked about the history of Karaism, first the origins, about how unclear they are, if you remember, and then how there was a golden age in the land of Israel in the 10th and 11th centuries, how the center of Karaism transferred in the 11th to the 15th centuries to Byzantium, to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. And then the Karaites moved from there to Eastern Europe, to the Crimea, to Lithuania, parts of what's now Ukraine. There was always a community in Egypt, and then how with the founding the state of Israel, the center of Karaite life is now in the state of Israel. The second session last week, I talked about Karaite practice and how it's different than Rabbinite practice. Talked about the alternate calendar, how the holiday celebrations are different. Some of them are on different days. Some of them have different names. Some of them don't exist at all. For instance, Hanukkah, the Karaites don't observe. I talked about the different dietary laws, that Karaites can eat meat and milk from different species at the same time, the same meal. They don't have separate dishes. On the other hand, they're very strict about the biblical laws of purity and impurity, which Rabbinic Judaism mostly ignores. The liturgy, which is totally different than the liturgy that we're used to in the Rabbinic Siddur prayer book, and questions of personal status, marriage, divorce, and the relationship between Karaites and Rabbinites when it comes to the possibility of marriage. And if you remember, I said that there are problems of marriage because of the possible status of being mamzer, of being this product of an incestuous or adulterous relationship. But there are halachic ways of overcoming that. And historically, there always have been marriages between Karaites and Rabbinites, even in Eastern Europe, where it wasn't allowed. What I'd like to do today is talk about the intellectual accomplishments, what it is that the Karaites did, not their practice, but their literature, their beliefs, their theology, their biblical commentaries, and other such intellectual accomplishments. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the future, if one can talk about the future. And just to remind you, much more than what I'm saying now can be found in this book that recently came out. Excuse me. Very happy to see that every time I give one of these lectures here, my numbers in Amazon go up. So thank you very much. Let me talk a little bit about the what I mean by intellectual accomplishments. And to begin with, I have to talk, excuse me. I have to talk about Judaism in the 9th century and 10th century. The vast majority of Jews lived in countries which were ruled by Muslims. And the vast majority of Jews in the world spoke Arabic. I know it's hard for us to think about it right now, but we're used to a Eurocentric view of Judaism. But if you look at the 9th, 10th century, Jews live under Islam. And if you look at Rabbinic Judaism, there was the Talmud, which was the Mishnah and the Gemara together. There was Midrashim, but there is no such thing as a Jewish book. There's no Jewish authors. If I ask you which Jews wrote books up to the 9th century, you won't be able to come up with any names because people didn't put their names on books. There are also no books with discrete subjects with authors' names on it. The Gaonim were the ones who were in charge of propagating Talmudic Judaism. And as a result of the Islamic influence, and I'll talk about that, they started to write some law codes. But there are still no books, for instance, no theology, no biblical commentaries, none of the books. If you go into a Jewish bookstore today, you wouldn't find anything like that in 9th century Jewish bookstores. There were no Jewish bookstores in the 9th century. In addition to the rabbinic Jews and the Gaonim, there were also many non-rabbinic groups floating around. There were Messianic groups. There's the Anans group. There are the Proto-Karaite groups. So they were all competing with each other at the same time. Some of these non-rabbinic Jews wrote books of commandments, but otherwise there's very little literature. So at this time, Islam was a great challenge to Judaism. First of all, it was a challenge because they were spreading and they were trying to convert. They were trying to convert Christians and Muslims and pagans and Zoroastrians. We sometimes think about Islam being spread with the sword and the Quran. They had a book in one hand and a sword in the other hand, which I know someone who's an Islamist says that's pretty difficult to do if you're riding a horse, to hold a sword in one hand and a book in the other hand. But they were spreading, so there was the pressure on Jews to convert. But there's also the pressure on Jews to match the intellectual achievements. Muslims were writing in Arabic. They were beginning to discuss theology. They were beginning to interpret their book, and the Jews had nothing like this. So, for instance, in terms of systematic theology, if we look at the Bible, we'll see that there are lots of theological ideas about God and about the world and about the creation and about the reward and punishment, but nothing of it about this is systematically presented. And the Muslims themselves had a problem because the Quran is also not a systematic book of theology. It has stories, it has exhortations, it has things to do, not very much in terms of law. So the Muslims were struggling with a new religion, how to explain it, how to systematize it. They were meeting Christians who had a tradition of theology which came as a result of the Christian encounter with Greek philosophy. And the Muslims are starting to write a lot and show how they can investigate their religion intellectually and also understand their texts. As I said, the Quran has many things which are unclear, so the Muslims started writing commentaries on the Quran. Muslims also had, in addition to the Quran, oral traditions, the Hadith, and they had to figure out which oral traditions were acceptable. So the Muslims came up with ways of justifying their oral traditions, which sounds very much like what the rabbis were doing with the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash. And the Muslims had lists of people who transmitted these traditions called isnad, very similar to what we have at the beginning of Pirkei Avot. So these are, the Jews see what the Muslims are doing. The Jews are speaking Arabic. The Christians by now, this time, are now also speaking Arabic. And the Jews start imitating the Muslims. They start writing books on discrete topics, writing books of theology. They're writing law codes. They're beginning to comment on the Bible. So how do the Karaites fit in? There was a time, quite some time ago, when there was it's called the pan-Karaite theory of Jewish intellectual accomplishment, that all Jewish accomplishments, rabbinic accomplishments, were either were responding to Karaism or were influenced by Karaism or is because of Karaism. This is probably exaggerated, but it is true that in a certain extent, the rabbis, the rabbinites, were trying to catch up both with the Muslims and the Karaites. So look first at the biblical exegesis, at the biblical commentary. As I said, they saw Muslims commenting on the Quran, trying to make sure that it is consistent. And Jews started writing commentaries too. Well, the first commentaries we have, running commentaries, seem to be written by Karaites. Perhaps the first one, Daniel Kumasi, whom you may remember was the first Zionist who came to Israel and asked all the communities to send representatives and money to the land of Israel and pray for the coming of the Messiah. Up till then, we have the Midrash, which could be according to the order of the Bible, but it's not a commentary. It's more a homiletics based on the biblical text. But a commentary trying to explain exactly what the text means was foreign to Jewish community until living under Islam, and apparently the Karaites got there before the Rabbinites. Now, some people probably think that they're Karaites, they must be scripturalists, they must be literal, that all their commentaries must be very, very literal. Well, that's not true. First of all, as I pointed out the last couple of times, there are many things in which the Karaites are not literal or don't understand the Bible literally, as opposed to the Rabbinites. In addition to the laws, there are a lot of narrative portions in the Bible, and the narrative portions leave room for expansion. Now, the rabbis did it through the Midrash. The Karaites try to do it through a type of exegesis which tries to understand, or tries to explain the psychological makeup of the authors, how the different parts, the literary aspects of the text, and they wrote long commentaries. Most of the first ones are lost because, or not lost, but haven't been published because they were written in Judeo-Arabic. Again, that's Arabic and Hebrew letters. And when the Karaites moved out of away from Islamic countries, most of them did not get translated, and they didn't get translated by the Rabbinites either. One commentator I'd like to mention is Yefed ben Eli. Yefed ben Eli lived to the end of the 10th century. He was part of this golden age of Karaism, and he was the most outstanding Karaite exegete, commentator on the Torah, on the Bible. He wrote commentaries on every book of the Bible. First one to do that. Saadia Gaon, who was 2 generations earlier, wrote a number of commentaries on the Bible, but not on the whole Bible. Now, some of you may be slightly familiar with Yefet, because if you look at the Art Scroll Chumash, you'll see in the commentary, they often mention someone named Yefes. Now, it's interesting that some of you, as you know, Art Scroll does not like quoting people who they think are not reliable Orthodox Jews, and suddenly they have Yefes in their commentary. The reason they have this Yefes or Yefet is because he's mentioned often by Abraham ibn Ezra. Abraham ibn Ezra in the 12th century in Spain and then in the rest of Europe was very much influenced by Karaite commentaries on the Bible, exegesis, and he often quoted them approvingly. Actually, most of the time when he approved, he didn't say that he's taking it from the Karaites. When he disapproved, then he said he argued with them. If you look at Ibn Ezra's commentaries, they're full of anti-Karaite comments, but he's still very much influenced. He still very much uses their comments. In addition, the Karaites use their commentaries to teach theology. If there were theological issues that arose from the text, they would discuss that. Usually, and I'll talk about later, through a certain type of Islamic theology. So this contributed greatly to the Jewish reservoir of Bible commentaries. Let me mention one thing which is sort of unique to Karaite exegesis, is the idea of the redactor or the editor. Whenever Yefet and some of the other Karaites discussed the biblical text, they talked about how the editor put this in for this reason, or didn't put in something else for that reason. So in addition to the authors, let's say the prophets themselves, they talk often about the editor. Some Byzantine rabbinites adopted that. They call it a sadran, but it never took off in general Jewish biblical commentaries. It is interesting, though, that they also talk about the editor of the 5 books of Moses. And this is a big debate among the readers of these commentaries as to whether or not, when they're talking about the editor, they're meaning Moses or they're talking about somebody else. I think it's probably Moses, but it's hard to tell. So we have many, many commentaries. There's another aspect of the commentaries, which is the linguistic aspects. They're very often make comments on different words in the Hebrew. Some of you may be familiar with Ibn Ezra's commentary, does that very often. Even Rashi, who's, as a French Jew who's not that interested in grammar as such, he also makes grammatical comments. So, and part of the disagreement between Rabbinites and Karaites was how to interpret the Hebrew language. And as I mentioned last week, one of the principles of Karaism is that one must learn Hebrew in order to be able to understand the Bible. As the Karaites moved to Byzantium and couldn't read these Judeo-Arabic commentaries, they translated some of them, not all of them. They made summaries of them, and that way they continued their traditions. But by the end of the 13th century, the Karaites in Byzantium were inundated with Sephardi biblical commentaries, Sephardim who moved there from Spain, and their commentaries. And by the end of the 13th century, they were more influenced by the Rabbinite commentators than by their own Karaite commentators. Not necessarily, not in terms of the law, but in terms of narrative. So, for instance, you have Ibn Ezra, but also Rashi, Radak, Nachmanides. And I think part of it was easier for them to read these commentaries than the translations from the Judeo-Arabic. Ibn Ezra was so popular that he was sort of adopted by the Karaites, despite the fact the nasty things he says about the Karaites. They said that he was really a closet Karaite. He was afraid to announce it in public, but he really believed in Karaism. They did something similar with Maimonides and said Maimonides was really a Karaite, despite Maimonides' nasty things he says about Karaism. And they adopted him, and for Maimonides and for Ibn Ezra, they just said they were afraid to tell their true opinions. Okay, what about theology? Theology is a problem because you have in the Bible, as I said, theological ideas, the existence of God, that there's one God, God created the world, but it's unclear. For instance, is the God of the Bible, does the God of the Bible have a body or doesn't have a body? Now, we're so used to Maimonides' strict judgment that Maimonides saying that believing that God has a body is totally heretical. So, for instance, when I ask my students in class whether the Bible teaches that God has a body, they say, no, obviously not, because it says that God has no body or no form of a body. But I said, that's what Maimonides says. That's not necessarily what the Bible says. So they have that problem. They have the problem of creation. That in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Did God create out of something, or did God create out of nothing? Or reward and punishment. We read in the second paragraph of the Shema and many other parts of the Torah that if you observe the law, you'll have good things happen. And if you don't observe the law, bad things will happen. Well, we can give plenty examples of people who observe the law and bad things happen to them, and those people who are totally wicked who seem to be having a good time. So the Bible itself recognizes, the book of Job raises this question, but there's no systematic treatment of the question of reward and punishment. What about God's knowledge? We seem to think, the Bible seems to tell us that God has knowledge of everything, knows everything. Does God know this in advance? If God doesn't know in advance what's going to happen, does he learn new things? Does God learn new things when these things happen? Or if God knew from eternity that in June of what we call 2022, I would be giving a lecture in Torah in Motion, a lecture series, did I have any choice about that? Could I not have given a lecture series? Could Rabbi Kelman not have invited me if God knew this from eternity? So we have this kind of problem. the Midrash often tries to deal with some of these issues and fill in some of the theological problems, but it's not systematic. Who did develop a systematic theology? The Muslims and the Jews, both the Rabbinites and the Karaites, took from them. So we start out with a type of philosophy or theology, which is called kalam, which means word in Arabic. And this is a type of apologetic theology which bases itself on proving the existence of God because the world was created. Also, there's a theodicy that everything is for good, that no matter what bad thing happens, there's some kind of good reason for it. It's not that God is not powerful enough. It's not that God is not good, but there's some reason. The reason might be to give future reward to the person who's suffering, but there is a reason for this suffering. Well, the Gaonim saw this theology and they liked it. Rav Saadia Gaon's book of Beliefs and Opinions, the first major medieval Jewish philosophical work, is a Jewish version of this type of kalam theology, and the Karaites adopted it as well. So we have the most famous, the most important Karaite theologian, the beginning of the 11th century, someone named Yusuf al-Basir, Joseph the Seer, which means he might have been blind, and he wrote a number of theological works in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, very similar to the Arabic, similar to the theology of the Muslims. Eventually, though, a number of Jews, especially a number of Rabbinite Jews, decided that the kalam was too apologetic, was not scientific, was not really in accord with rationalism. And they adopted the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle, from the 4th century before the Common Era, was considered in the Middle Ages the philosopher, but his philosophy was a real challenge to Judaism and to all revealed religions. Aristotle's God is thought, thinking thought. Aristotle's God doesn't know us, doesn't know what's happening. There's no providence. Aristotle's God didn't create the world. Aristotle's God is the unmoved mover, the first cause. So those Jews who were exposed to Aristotle's philosophy were challenged how to adopt it to Judaism. And the most important person who did that was Maimonides. Maimonides was an Aristotelian. He was a follower of Aristotle, but he tried to show how the God of Abraham, the God of revelation, the God of providence, was the same as the God of Aristotle. I won't go into the details. There are many different ways of interpreting Maimonides. Some think that he was extremely radical in his thought. Some think that he tried to harmonize between philosophy and the Torah. But Maimonides attacked this kalam, and he says this was adopted by the Gaonim and the Karaites. And this is the one place in Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed where Karaites are mentioned by name. And Maimonides replaced it with his Aristotelian philosophy. So the Karaites stuck with kalam a little bit longer than the Rabbinites, but eventually they adopted it as well. And it's just like the Rabbinites, who some had a radical interpretation of Aristotle. In other words, almost denied any providence or divine knowledge. Others had a more moderate view, and the Karaite view was generally more moderate. In other words, that they try to incorporate traditional theology with this new philosophy. Eventually, it's interesting, Karaites accepted or moved on to Kabbalah, some of them, not all of them. But the earlier Karaites denied any sort of popular religion, any sort of mysticism. They criticized the Midrash, I'll talk about it in a few minutes, because of its tendencies to see God in a non-rational manner. But yet the strength of Kabbalah, the influence of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, was so great that in Eastern Europe in the 17th, 18th century, there are a number of Karaites who began to adopt Kabbalah as well. What I'm trying to say is that Karaite thought is very much parallel to Rabbinite thought. They worked on parallel tracks. Karaites and Rabbinites read each other's works. Certainly the Karaites read Rabbinite works in the early modern period, in the modern period, and were much influenced by them. So one could say that there's one Jewish philosophy, one Jewish philosophical movement in which Karaites and Rabbinites joined in. All right, what about some other achievements? Those of you who've seen inside the Torah scroll know that there are no accent marks, there are no vocalization, there are no nikud, we say, vowels. And therefore, it's very hard to know exactly how to read the Torah without these vowels. In the 9th and 10th centuries, there was a movement called the Masoretic movement, the Masoretes in Tiberias, the Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali families, who standardized the reading of the Bible in terms of its vocalization, the vowels, and in terms of its musical accents. If you compare, for instance, the Masoretic text with the Dead Sea Scroll biblical text, see there are many differences between them, but the text we use is the Masoretic text. Were the Masoretes Karaites? Were they B'nai Mikra or Baalei Mikra, the experts in scripture? There are many people who think so, yes, that their interest in Bible was a result of, or maybe caused their rejecting the Talmud. We don't know for sure, and in the 9th century, the lines between the Karaites and the Rabbinites were not so strict. I mentioned in the first session that I think it's Saadia Gaon who was responsible not for defeating Karaism, but for drawing the lines firmly between the two groups. All right, so we have the Masoretic activity, which may or may not have been Karaite. We have grammatical activity. The first Karaite grammarians were Karaites in Persia. This again is very technical. I don't want to get into much detail, but from those of you who are listening who know anything about Hebrew grammar know that we use we divide everything into verbs with 3-letter roots, mostly 3-letter roots. The Karaites, however, saw the noun as the basic form and not the verb. Eventually, they also took over the 3-letter root view of the Hebrew language. But the example of grammar is also another one in which the Muslim influence is great. The Muslims trying to understand the Quran and trying to understand the Arabic language, which they thought was the best language in the world, they developed grammars of Arabic. So other people developed, the Jews developed grammars of Hebrew. Karaites did not write as much Hebrew poetry as the Rabbinites. Poetry was always a sore subject because the Muslims thought that their poetry proved the fact that Arabic is the best language. So Jews who normally wrote their theology or their biblical commentaries in Arabic wrote their poetry in Hebrew. At the time of the Golden Age in Spain, the Rabbinite Golden Age of Spain, Judah Levi, Solomon ibn Girol, Moses ibn Ezra, Abraham ibn Ezra, there were some Karaite poets, not very many. One of them wrote a number of very nice poems. His name is Moshe Deri. Some of you may be familiar with the Aryeh Deri in Israeli politics. Moshe Deri. They're all from the same place in Morocco. So he was a Karaite poet. Also of extreme interest is Karaite polemics. In the 10th century, when the competition was really very strong between the groups, we know of what could be called Karaite missionaries who went from place to place trying to drum up activity, drum up business, as it were, trying to convince all the Jews that the Karaite interpretation was the correct interpretation. Partially, it was attacking rabbinic literature as being nonsensical. They looked at, there are many midrashim, I mentioned before, they were sort of anti-rational. There's a famous midrash, well, I don't know if it's called a midrash, but a book called Shiur Koma, which has the dimensions of God's body. And the Karaites saw that as extremely blasphemous. It's interesting, the Christians use many of the same passages in rabbinic literature to argue the same thing, that the rabbis are blasphemous. You have descriptions of how God puts on tefillin, the phylacteries, and how God prays to God. Many of these midrashim, which are embarrassing also to the rabbinites, the Karaites attacked as indicative that Rabbinite Judaism could not be true Judaism. The disagreements among the rabbis, the Karaites said, if the Talmud is really divine, why are all the rabbis arguing with each other all the time? And every page of the Talmud, there are disagreements. And it says nowhere in the Talmud, God said to such and such a rabbi. The Bible says, the Torah says, God spoke to Moses, but it doesn't say any place in rabbinic literature that God spoke to the rabbis. So the Karaites use these arguments to say that the rabbinic Judaism is not divine. The oral Torah was not given on Sinai. These are human-made commandments which are observed by routine. And Karaism is the religion, is a form of Judaism which each person can investigate the Torah and come to his or her own conclusions. Of course, eventually they had their own traditions, I mentioned last time. Karaites not only polemicized, fought, or wrote arguments, treatises against rabbinites, they also wrote it against members of other religions. So you have, under Islam, a number of Karaite criticisms of Islam. I don't know how many of you know, but Jews under Islam generally did not say bad things about Islam, among other reasons why it was dangerous. But in addition to being dangerous, there's theologically, Judaism and Islam are very similar. But there are Muslims who attack there are Karaites who attack the Muslim idea that the Quran is impossible to imitate. And the Karaites were also involved in anti-Christian polemics. The Karaite arguments against Christianity and the Rabbinite arguments are very similar. And I'd say the Karaite book best known to those people who know Jewish literature was written in the 16th century by Isaac of Troki. It's called Chizuk Emunah, Faith Strengthened. This was an anti-Christian polemic. It turned into a bestseller. It was translated into multiple languages, and its arguments just about Christianity, there's nothing Karaite in the book, which is one of the ways it became a bestseller among Rabbinite Jews as well. The first part of the book is discusses verses from the Hebrew Bible, which the Christians take as predicting their religion and their Messiah. And the second part of the book is devoted to New Testament criticism. So there's a very encyclopedic work, Isaac of Troki in Lithuania, Trakai today. And it's a book became a bestseller among all Jews. Right. So if we look back at Karaite intellectual achievements, it seems that Karaism was a challenge to rabbinic Judaism. First of all, it was a challenge because it produced much of the same type of material, of literature. Second of all, it was a challenge because it got to some of these types of literature before the rabbis did. And of course, it was a challenge theologically because of the denial of the oral Torah and their arguments about the Sinaitic origin of the oral Torah, the fact that it was given, argued that it wasn't given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So you ask yourselves, well, where are they today? How come we don't have an intellectual challenge by Karaism today? Well, to a certain extent, the denial of the oral Torah is still a sensitive issue in traditional rabbinite milieus or education. But I'd say today, in terms of challenges to Judaism, is more the denial of both, not only the oral Torah, but the written Torah as well. In other words, secularization and biblical criticism and undermining religion is much more of a challenge to traditional Judaism today than Karaism is. And on the other hand, Karaism, the Karaites have become such a marginal group that they're not interested in challenging rabbinic Judaism. What they're interested in is survival and continuity. So I want to end up talking a little bit about the survival and continuity. I mentioned 2 times ago that in Eastern Europe, at the beginning of the 20th century, starting already in the end of the 18th century and then the 19th century, they realized that to be considered Jews by the governments, the Russian and Austrian governments, was not a good idea because there were all these anti-Jewish legislations. So they didn't say they weren't Jews. They just said we're different types of Jews, that we're not Jews who believe in the Talmud. The Talmud was a big bugaboo for Christians through the Middle Ages. We're not Jews who are moneylenders or whatever. We work the ground. We're productive Jews, and therefore we shouldn't be obligated by these laws. And they convinced in Austria, mostly in Russia, they convinced the czars not to penalize them with the Jewish tax laws and the Jewish draft laws, and they had a separate identity. Separate, but still part of the Jewish people. In the 20th century, as I explained 2 times ago, it was not enough not to be Jewish by religion, but they had to claim they weren't Jewish by race. With racial anti-Semitism at the beginning of the 20th century, even if you were a Karaite Jew, as long as you were a Jew racially, you were in trouble. And the Karaites, their survival mechanism in World War II and before World War II and under the Nazis was to deny their Jewish identity. And then when the war was over, they survived pretty well. And they were under the Soviet Union, where being religious, any type of religion, was bad. And therefore, their survival mechanism was to turn out to be just an ethnic group, a Turkish, Central Asian tribal group, sort of denying the religiosity, denying the commandments, didn't learn Hebrew, stopped circumcision, and basically separated themselves from Jewish community. There are some now who are trying to find their Jewish roots. They're becoming interested in Judaism. Some have even have immigrated to Israel. When the waves of immigration in the 1970s, the Karaites weren't interested, but when the Soviet Union fell and efforts were made by the Israeli government to bring Russian Karaites to Israel, some of them took up the offer. But the real continuity of the mainstream Karaite Jews is today in Israel and in the Bay Area of California. When one thinks about the future of Karaism, I at least are reminded of the statement usually attributed to Yogi Berra, sometimes said it's by Niels Bohr, the physicist, that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So can one say what will be with the Karaites? Very difficult. One can talk about the challenges. The religion all over the place is challenged by secularization, especially in Israel, where majority of the Jews, both Rabbinites and Karaites, are not observant. Question is, why to remain a Karaite? Well, if you're going to be a secular Jew, you might as well be a secular Rabbinite Jew as a secular Karaite Jew. It's also hard for to fit into into Israeli society if one wanted to maintain a separate Karaite identity. So, for instance, I often point out that it seems to me it's easier for American Jews not to observe Christmas than it is for Israeli Karaites not to observe Hanukkah. Because in America, North America, one could say to one's children, this is not our holiday, it's a religion, different religion. But in Israel, Hanukkah is a national holiday, it's a national Jewish holiday. So one can assume that more and more Karaites are somehow marking Hanukkah, whether giving gifts, lighting candles without a bracha, or acknowledging Hanukkah. But this all leads to greater assimilation. There are also other problems, which is that Israeli society is geared toward rabbinic Judaism. What I mean by that is people go to work, the holidays from work are the rabbinic or the Rabbinite holidays. Well, if you're a Karaite and your Yom Kippur is the day after everybody else's Yom Kippur, this is going to make it difficult if you have to go to work, or you have to go to the army, or if you have to, your kids are in school. Or the Karaite dietary laws. The Israeli army is kosher, but it's kosher for Rabbinite Jews. It's not kosher for Karaite Jews. So the pressures on the Karaites are very strong to try to figure out ways of maintaining their separate existence and maintaining their traditions. There is intermarriage among Karaites and Rabbinites, both in Israel and in America. After all, if you're both secular, what difference does it make if you're Karaite, Rabbinite, if you're just going to be Israeli or just part of the Jewish community in America? Quite a number of years ago, someone sent me an article from the Jewish newspaper in San Francisco about a 13-year-old young Karaite whose parents gave him the choice of having a Karaite bar mitzvah or a Rabbinite bar mitzvah. And the article is very heartwarming. It says that in order to maintain Karaite traditions, the boy chose to have a Karaite bar mitzvah rather than a Rabbinite bar mitzvah. But as I explained last week, there is no idea of bar mitzvah in Karaism. Fasting on Yom Kippur, as soon as you can fast, if you're old enough to understand it and can fast, then you have to start fasting. There's no idea of becoming obligated by the mitzvot at a particular time, a particular age. So that doesn't stop Karaites from having bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvah ceremonies because they're part of a larger Jewish community. What is of interest in the last few years is the Karaite taking of converts. Karaites have started almost soliciting non-Jews to convert to Karaite Judaism. And you could go online, look under Karaite Jewish University, or under, this is for Rabbi Kelman, who's going to become a Karaite. They tell you how you can convert to Karaism. And they have courses, they have online courses. For some reason, I don't know why, it's now the center is in Switzerland, and you can take this course for 2,500 Swiss francs. And at the end, if they approve, the Karaite court approves, they will convert people. Now, as I point out in my book, a lot of these converts, I mean, we're not talking vast numbers, we're talking tens, maybe low hundreds, but certainly very small numbers. A lot of them are previous fundamentalist Christians. These are people who believe that the Bible is the word of God, but then became disenchanted with the New Testament, who decide that the New Testament isn't the correct interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. And they went looking around for other alternatives. I'm taking this from the news accounts of these conversion ceremonies. And I'm assuming that people in rural and places, far-flung communities in America, A, couldn't find a rabbinic Jewish community, and B, when they went to talked about becoming Jewish and rabbinic Jewish as rabbinic Jews, they found out there's a thing called the Talmud. And it's not enough to accept the Bible. It's not enough to observe the Bible as it's written, but you have to observe the Talmud. So Karaism was a good fit for these people. And a number of them have become very active Karaites, have converted, and for quite a number of 100 years, the Karaites did not accept converts, and now they're beginning to accept converts. You can do it online, and then the conversion ceremony will be in place. It used to be in San Francisco. Now it's in Switzerland for some reason. Will this be the game changer? Will this accepting non-Jews as Karaites? Will intermarriage, where the non-Karaite partner in the couple takes on Karaism, will that be the game changer? It's very difficult to tell. The only thing that one can say is that a Jewish religious group, which has lasted 1,200 years, that's a pretty good record. And I think it's too early to count them out. So, as I said, I don't want to predict the future, but certainly they are around, and they're making every effort to continue being around. Should I look at the, let me look at these, the questions, comments. Okay. With the Muslims publishing books. Okay, the Muslims are writing books like crazy. We have so many Muslim books, and it was the Muslim model which the Jews, both Karaites and Rabbinites, adopted. Okay, the Jews in Jerba or Shomer Shabbat converse in Arabic. Yes, but the vast majority of Jews, as you noted, they do not live in Muslim countries and hadn't in around the year 1800. I think it's estimated there were 1 million Jews in this Muslim countries, 1 million Jews in Europe. But by the beginning of the 20th century, we're talking 17 million in Europe and 1 million or 2 million in Muslim countries. So there's really the vast majority of Jews pre-Shoah were Ashkenazi and in Christian countries. All right, someone said that Muslims were very late in printing books. Well, after Jews and Christians had started printing books. That is correct. So when someone said publishing, I'm not sure whether they were talking about issuing books, but certainly Muslims, the Muslim books and science and theology and philosophy, grammar preceded the Christian genres of these. Okay, Body of God. See Benjamin Summers' books and podcasts. Okay. What the Bible really teaches, I think is not important for my needs. It's how Jews afterwards reacted to what the Bible teaches. And one of the strengths of Judaism, especially rabbinic Judaism, is the ability to move beyond the Bible, both theology and law, and one's life. So they adjust. Rabbinic Judaism adjusts the Bible and the Talmud to the conditions of life. Some people would like to adjust it quicker and more emphatically, but even Karaites adjusted themselves to changes in reality. And the Karaites, for instance, originally had very strict incest laws. It almost became the case that Karaites couldn't find anybody to marry because everybody's related to everybody else by these strict incest laws. Karaites, I mentioned last week, until the 15th century, did not light candles in their houses before Shabbat, so they sat in darkness. To this day, officially don't have hot food on Shabbat. So there is, all religions react and change with the times. All right, the link between Karaites and Subotnikim in Europe. I think there might have been Subotnikim in Crimea. I certainly don't know enough about it. In the Crimea, the Rabbinite Jews in Crimea were a group called Krimchaks. They were followers, they had rabbinic Judaism, but they weren't mainstream rabbinic Jews either. Subotnikim were Sabbath observers, were Christians who became Sabbath observers, and some of them converted to Judaism, and some actually made their way to Israel, pre-state Israel. Okay, I can read in line, English translation of Isaac Atroki's Chizuk Emunah. Just be familiar with the fact that it's not a good translation. In fact, we don't have a good text of Chizuk Emunah, and the English translation is particularly poor. It was done in the I think the 1860s in England, and there was an attempt not to be too offensive to the Christian environment in which it was done, so it was not a particularly accurate translation. Karaite synagogue in Albany, New York, in the Chacham's house. Guess that means that Albany has more Karaites than Montreal or New York. I don't know those statistics. What rabbinite kosher food could a Karaite not eat? Well, start with meat. The rabbinite slaughter of meat is done in a different manner than the Karaite one. It's more or less the idea, but but there's a different blessing said on it, slightly different procedures, different items, different parts of the body of the animal are checked to see whether or not it's kosher. So that's one thing. Also, there's certain fats which the rabbinites eat and the Karaites don't. The Torah prohibits eating chalev, fat, but certain fats, the rabbis say, are not covered by it. For instance, there's something called the aliyah, which is the fat tail of a sheep. Now, I don't know how many rabbinites eat that nowadays, but this is a part that the rabbinites eat, the Karaites don't eat. So that would be the problem for the Karaites. So someone asks, can observing Karaites eat food which is kosher according to the rabbinites? So there would be certain problems. Also, there's a problem of Passover. I mentioned last week that Karaites don't have any food which has any sort of leavening activity whatsoever, and therefore do not drink wine on Pesach. They drink grape juice made from raisins. So the very Ethiopian Jews also have a very similar procedure, very, very little that they can eat. However, there's one way in which Karaites do have an advantage, which is that they're willing to eat food which they think is kosher, prepared in dishes which might not be kosher. In other words, they could go into a restaurant and have fish or dairy or other food like that prepared on the same dishes which previous were used for non-kosher items. This is something which observant rabbinites don't do. What ceremony accompanies conversion? Mikveh, Mila. Okay. So mikveh, there's no mikveh altogether. Karaites do not believe in mikveh. They believe that purification is done by showering and not by running water over people and not by immersion. When I looked on circumcision, when I looked on the site today of the Karaite Jewish University and the organization in Karaites in Europe, they have a whole procedure. They discuss what goes on there, and one of the things they said is that the candidates for conversion have to be circumcised to begin with, and if they're not, that they have to circumcise themselves, adding at their own expense, and then before they can be converted. There is when I asked the person, former chief rabbi, what kind of procedure they did, he said that it came from the story in Deuteronomy about the beautiful woman who was captured in the war, who was made to well, it's unclear whether to cut the nails or let the nails grow and cutting the hair. So there's certain those types of physical activities, but otherwise they don't have immersion in a mikveh. Yeah, so there is a Karaite community in Lausanne, in Switzerland. However, the address of the Karaites in Europe is given in a place called Eglezo, which is in the north east corner of Switzerland, whereas Lausanne is in the southwest corner. So I don't really know what's there, and I've asked my student, the former chief rabbi, what the story is. Someone asked about translation of the book, Criticism of the New Testament, a number of polemical books which are translated to English, and I said that Faith Strengthened is also. Okay. Okay, someone asked about Karaites eating food prepared in non-kosher pots, non-kosher, and I said yes, they would. Okay, I think that's, is there any more questions?
That's it, unless anybody wants to ask a question orally, but I'll just say the fact that they'll donate our shkita means they are really Jewish. So that's for sure. Okay, and all right, I think somebody had their hand up before a second ago. If anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, Bakasha, go ahead. If not,
how do women convert if there's no mikveh? How do women convert if there's no mikveh?
No, so mikveh is used for purification ceremony in rabbinic Judaism. Karaites say that if you immerse in a body of water, then the impurity that you have will be transferred to the water, and then the next person who gets in will get the impurity back. So when it comes to regular impurity, what I mean by that is menstrual impurity, postpartum impurity, impurity contact with the dead, impurity as a result of contact with the corpses of non-kosher animals. All of that type of purification is done through showering. It's not done by immersion into a mikveh. I do not remember seeing in the literature that showering was part of the conversion ceremony into Karaism, so that they don't have that sort of immersion or obligation, as far as I can tell.
I think in Reflections of the Rav, which is really the first book they put out by the Rav in 79 or 80, in English, where I have reconstructions of some of his drashot. So I think he has their whole essay on haza'ah versus the mikveh because we also have this idea of sprinkling. In other words, the idea that they have a shower is not such a foreign idea. We also have a mikveh, but the paraduma gets sprinkled. They don't go to the mikveh on the third and seventh day. And I don't remember the whole piece the Rav talks about, but the difference what hazah is done by others, mikveh you do on your own. He develops a whole idea of philosophy between the two different types of purification by hazah or tet kavim we had later on in the time of Ezra, this idea of 9 whatever kavas of water, but it's not going into the mikveh, we sprinkle on. So I think it's a very not at all unusual that the Karaites would say we don't need a mikveh, we can just do the sprinkling of water.
Someone asked about the numbers. A good estimation, in other words, probably a little bit generous estimation for Israel is about 40,000 Karaites, again, depending how you count. The rest of the world, maybe 10,000 Karaites, certainly no more than 50,000 Karaites altogether. So we're talking minuscule numbers today, and which is why they are worried about continuity and survival, but they've done pretty well for 1,200 years. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating and I guess I could say a little unusual series, which I think is wonderful. And Thank you very much, really, to open up our world to a Judaism we've all heard about. We all know a little bit, but as you said to me right at the beginning, people think they know a little bit about Karaism, but they know a lot less than they think, which is probably true about a lot of things we think we know about. But that's why we constantly learn. So I want to thank you and enjoy. I think you're going away for a little bit. Enjoy your travels, and
Thank you very much.
and thank you for being part of the Tim team. Thank you very much. Okay, Shuli Mishkin will be speaking in 29 minutes. In 29 minutes, we'll keep the link class on. You can, just turn off your screen, mute button, video. But we'll be back here in 29 minutes for Shuli today. She's talking about Jerusalem, the city of synagogue. So everybody's welcome to stay, and you do have time to invite your friend. You have 29 minutes. Send an email to a friend, invite them to join in, as you always do for all our classes. And this evening, Rabbi Aaron Greenberg, who runs JLIC here in Toronto, which is a little bit different than the other JLICs, because Toronto students generally do not live on campus, unlike pretty much everywhere else. Most of the Shomer Shabbos kids in Toronto, I'd say Kimat all of them, live at home. Anyways, he's the head of JLIC. He will be giving the Parsha here tonight at 8:30. Parsha Shlach Lecha and Chutz La'aretz. That's why, Dr. Lasker, we make the shir at 3:30 in the morning in Israel. We don't want anybody to be upset that they come to the Parsha shir and it's the wrong Parsha. But okay, I don't know what we'll do after Tisha B'Av when we unite. But okay, that's just Achar Hamaisa. We can make up an explanation for anything. So that's 8:30 tonight. Tomorrow morning, 9:35. Please God, my shir on the Siddur. Continuing, we're going to start at Hodu Shem into Psukkah Zimra already, and then on Sunday morning at 11:15, Rabbi Liebtag. And then Mark Shapiro will have his last class for the summer this Monday night on the rise of reform, the traditional response to reform. And then on Tuesday, Tova Genzel continues her series that we just began this week, and Lori Novik finishes her series on Levinas and the Talmud. Okay, then we got all our regular classes. So we look forward to seeing you and learning with you, you and your friends. Now you have 27 minutes to invite a friend to the missions class. Okay. Everybody, thank you. We'll see y'all soon.
Thank you.
I thought Shuli said she was taking a week off. Did I?
That's why we sent a special email that she wasn't. I'm right. Got to read the emails. Right. She was. That was the original plan. And then she emailed me after Shabbos. What was happening this week isn't happening. So I did send out 2 extra emails about that. But I understand not everybody reads the emails. But
I don't get them. So that's
well, if everybody invites a friend, so then, Pristama, you'll hear about it. But yes, Shuli will be on in 27 minutes, please God. So no vacation. So
Rabbi Kelman,
yes,
just a really technical thing. And the email that came out that says, come to this lecture for Rabbi Lasker, and it says recordings and whatever, click here.
Right.
You click there, you go to Rabbi Schulman's thing on methodology.
So that was a mistake. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I can't, okay. I appreciate that. Thank you. I always appreciate when people point out mistakes, especially they do it in a nice way. That's it's just the wrong link. Just the wrong thing. So thank you very much. I don't know what the link is on Shuli's, but hopefully that's right. But you can always find from the website, you can get to it. But okay. So people listen to Rabbi Shulman, that's also fine.
I clicked on the link and it took me to the right lecture.
Oh.
So I'll try again.
I will go check now and see what's going on, and I'll ask.
I got an email at 8 o'clock this morning and the Zoom link was correct.
No, actually, I think she's
Zoom is correct.
Link to previous courses, not to
Zoom
come to class. There's a link to come to class. That's how you're all here. And then there's a link if you want to look up the sources, which he doesn't post anyway because he's not doing a source sheet.
Okay,
you want to listen to past lectures. So in other words, you want to hear the parts 1 and 2 of this series. So you click here. So apparently that's the click that goes.
It was there. It was there.
No, that's the one that's wrong. But thank you so much for Tova Genzel. She's fabulous, and the first one was so good.
Yeah, I haven't listened to it yet. I hope to listen to it this week and whatever. I won't be able to come this Tuesday either. I'm in staff meetings, but whatever. And but okay, thank you. That's why we record everything. Listen, as many people as come to class, I think more people listen after class, or as many people listen. It's Baruch Hashem. Okay. but live is always better. Has a certain, okay, 25.
Thank you.
minutes. Okay,
Thank
we'll
you
see
very
y'all
much.
soon. Oh, I'm going to
Take
turn
care.
off my video and we'll see you in about 25 minutes. Thank you very much.